Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Nashville Next Speaker Series. My name is Marty Heflin, and I am a member of the Nashville District Council of the Urban Land Institute, ULI, and I was one of the folks that was involved in putting together the background report on infrastructure, which will be featured in tonight's discussions as well. Our featured speaker tonight, Bill Fulton, will be addressing the high cost of America's inefficient development patterns. And the optimal use of existing infrastructure is obviously a big piece of that puzzle. There's more to all of this than just planning and cost, though. We have a special place, and I think that's the reason that so many of you are here tonight. We have a special place in this city. And as Wendell Berry observed, there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desacreded places. The effort that we are all about is to help keep what is special about Nashville special. Our previous Nashville Next speakers discussed equity, prosperity, sustainability, the environment, and health and livability. And tonight we're going to focus on the hidden cost of growth, the stuff that is under and on the ground, and the related cost of providing these services. Our timing is particularly good as we are in the middle of Transit Week here, and the details of that are available on transitnownashville.org, and I highly recommend you go check that website out. I don't know if we have any council members with us tonight. If they are, I certainly thank you very much for your presence and your continued support. The Nashville Next Speaker Series is made possible through the sponsorship of the Greater Nashville Association of Realtors, Regent Homes, and the Village Fund. I want to say a special thank you to all of our sponsors for their assistance in bringing this wonderful set of speakers and their ideas to Nashville. Tonight's speaker, Bill Fulton, works for Smart Growth America, a coalition which advocates for smart growth solutions to create great neighborhoods, support businesses and jobs, provide transportation options, and keep communities affordable. The organization that I'm here tonight to represent, the Urban Land Institute, provides leadership in the responsible use of land and in creating and sustaining thriving communities worldwide and here in Nashville. ULI is committed to convening leaders from across the fields of real estate and land use policy to exchange best practices and to serve community needs. We are involved in fostering collaboration within and beyond our membership through mentoring, dialogue, and problem solving. We explore issues of urbanization, conservation, regeneration, land use, capital formation, and sustainable development. Advancing land use policies and design practices that respect the uniqueness of both the built and the natural environments. And most of all, we're involved in sharing knowledge with each other to learn from each other's experiences. One of the focus areas for ULI has been infrastructure, and about a year ago, our district council here in Nashville partnered with the American Society of Civil Engineers, Tennessee District, and together we have produced the Music City Infrastructure Report, which will be coming out soon. I'm holding the draft copy here, and a lot of the research that was done for this was included into the report for Nashville Next. As you can see, therefore, there's a natural fit between what Bill Fulton is going to talk about, the Smart Growth America's work, and the work here of ULI Nashville. We're very pleased to be hosting the event tonight. Infrastructure, public services, and the cost of providing these are topics we will be discussing throughout Nashville Next. For additional local discussion, the topic of infrastructure and services, please read the background reports that are available online for this topic: infrastructure, transportation, public libraries, and public safety. These reports are found on the NashvilleNext.net website. Now, before Bill Fulton takes the stage, for those of you who have attended these other Speaker Series events, you know that throughout the Nashville Next planning process, we will be highlighting one of Nashville's distinctive strengths, our accomplished and diverse arts community. Nashville Next is pleased to feature Nashville artists who show us how art not only entertains, it enlightens and opens conversations about the world around us. I am pleased, therefore, to invite Audra Harvey from Abrasive Media to the stage to introduce tonight's featured group, Fall.
Hello, thank you for joining us for this wonderful presentation. I represent an organization called Abrasive Media. We exist to facilitate and to advocate for artists. Now, that can sound like a very vague term, but real and practically it just means that we are gathering resources that every artist needs in order for artists to be able to share in those resources and then translate that into sharing also in the collaborative development of creative works. For that purpose, we have an artist residency program. Rebekah Hampton, the presenter that you're about to see, is the pilot artist resident, actually, of Abrasive Media. She's been with us for 3 years. And in that time, she is undertaken the process of developing an aerial and contemporary dance company. That means the company dances on the ground using contemporary and modern dance. And they also dance above the ground using aerial dance and a variety of apparatus. You will find fall in all sorts of places, from fringe festivals to hanging from trees, to site-specific works and artisan fairs, to traditional theater performances. And fall is really one of the groundbreaking artists in what I believe is about to become a renaissance of contemporary dance in Nashville. We have a wealth of talent in this city, in the dance community, and I'm honored that we are able to present some of that talent to you. This piece that Rebekah is going to be performing is actually an excerpt of a larger piece that was performed at the Nashville Fringe Festival. And from that work, Rebekah took it into a period of collaboration with Marcia Barsky of Company Rose, who then took an entirely different interpretation on the piece. So this is an example of work that is developed in terms of collaboration. So without further ado, I would like to present Rebekah Hampton of Fall, performing Acceptance with Joy.
Thank you so much, Rebekah Hampton. That was absolutely captivating. That's Fall, everyone. That's just very inspiring piece. All right, let's move on to the prime order of the day tonight. Let me tell you a little bit about Nashville Next and tonight's event. Nashville Next is a planning process. It's 2 years of county-wide planning that is intended to ensure Nashville's well-being and prosperity for the next 25 years. We're looking at the best and, well, sometimes the worst practices from around the country, for as Thomas Merton once observed, the past will not tell us what we ought to do, but it will tell us what to avoid. And hopefully we'll be able to, through this process, avoid some mistakes that other municipalities have made. The Nashville Next planning process combines the ideas and input of people who care about Nashville, people like yourselves, as well as experts on topics important to our growth. Law and chaos are the dual creative principles of nature, and the planning process certainly incorporates both. The Nashville Next Speaker Series is helping us discuss ideas and issues as we simultaneously gather community input through community meetings and events and our online tools. At the end of the Nashville Next planning process, we will have a plan that looks at art and culture, the economic and workforce development, education, environment, transportation, equity, inclusion and diversity, livable and healthy communities, public safety, children and youth, and more. Did I mention it's comprehensive? The Speaker Series brings nationally recognized thought leaders to Nashville to discuss topics that are relevant to the country's and Nashville's future. These speakers challenge us with new ideas and new strategies to address some of the greatest challenges and opportunities facing our city. This evening, we are pleased to have Bill Fulton join us. Bill brings a national perspective on the topic of infrastructure, services, and the cost of providing these when our cities develop an inefficient, sprawling development practices. If you are interested in a local perspective on these topics, in addition to the background reports available at NashvilleNext.net, the local conversation on infrastructure, services, and the cost of providing these will continue tomorrow. There's an event on News Channel 5's Open Line, and Nashvillians Kim Hawkins of Hawkins Partners and Dylan Brown for the Center for Independent Living of Middle Tennessee will join me to discuss tonight's speech and share our thoughts on Nashville's infrastructure, services, and the cost of providing these to a growing city. Open Line will be aired from 7 to 8 p.m. on News Channel 5 tomorrow night. Now, a few notes about this evening's format. After Bill Fulton speaks, he will take questions from the audience. Then as you entered the auditorium, you were given a comment/questionnaire card. Now please fill these out if you have not already done so and return them to planning staff members that you see here before you leave, because this is what will give us the feedback on the speaker series and make sure that we are reaching the community that we need to. If you have not received a comment card and would like one, please raise your hand now. I see a few hands going up, so planning staff can assist there. Great. We will get those distributed to you. Thank you. Please do silence your cell phones, pagers, I guess no one carries a pager anymore now, but your iPhones. However, we do encourage you to outreach through social media. So if you hear something interesting, text it to Nashville Next, and that number is 615-970-6600. I'll just say it real quick one more time, 615-970-6600, or share it on Facebook or Twitter with hashtag NashvilleNext. You can also leave comments with staff members. Now it is my privilege to introduce Bill Fulton. Bill is the Vice President and Director of Policy Development and Implementation at Smart Growth America. Prior to joining Smart Growth America, Bill worked on urban planning and economic development in projects that included the creation of transit-oriented development, creating tools to identify and quantify infill development potential, and launching high-tech business incubators. Bill is an author, one of my favorites, The Regional City, Planning for the End of Sprawl, co-authored with Peter Calthorpe. He is a senior scholar at the Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California and the former mayor of Ventura, California. A native of the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York, Bill graduated from St. Bonaventure University and holds graduate degrees in journalism and public affairs from the American University in Washington, D.C., and urban planning from UCLA in Los Angeles. Please join me in giving a warm Nashville welcome to Bill Fulton.
Good evening, everybody. I want to say thank you to Rebekah for that very inspiring piece of dance. Now you're going to now a planner is going to show you a bunch of Excel charts. I hope that's okay with you. I'm very aware of the fact that when I woke up this morning, the headline in the paper was, "Planner urges less sprawl." This is a little like waking up in the morning and reading a headline that says, "Dog bites man," right? Not exactly very surprising. What I kind of hoped it would say, and it actually does say if you read the article, is former mayor urges fiscal responsibility, okay? Because one of the things that the main topic of what I want to talk about tonight is, as was advertised, the fiscal impact on taxpayers and on your local communities and your local government, on everybody's local government, the fiscal impact of different development patterns. And I want to talk about that tonight in terms of national trends, and I want to talk a little bit about Nashville as well, because Marty talked about the infrastructure report that ULI has been working on and others. Smart Growth America recently did and released today a report on the operating cost impact of different development patterns on the general fund for Nashville and Davidson County. And I'll go into that in a couple of minutes. But let me first talk about a few things. There are three major trends as you move forward to try to plan Nashville for the next 20 or 30 years. There are three major trends that are true all over America and also true here that I think you have to bear in mind. The first one is that the market for neighborhoods and communities is changing dramatically. The second one is that the recipe for economic growth has changed. And the third one is that nobody in this country can anymore afford to spend tax money to pay for inefficiency. All those three things, to me, add up to the same thing, which is that as we plan the future of our cities and our communities in this country, and as you plan the future of Nashville-Davidson County, you have to bear this in mind when you think about development decisions and when you think about the development patterns that you're going to pursue. So let me talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk for a little while about the market changing, because I think that's really, really important. I'm going to talk just for a minute or two about how the recipe for economic growth is changing. And I'm going to talk for quite a while, actually, about the fiscal impact of different development patterns and my view that we can no longer afford to use tax money to subsidize development patterns that cost more than they make for taxpayers. So let's begin with the market. The market for neighborhoods and communities is changing. Okay, here's where I start with the charts, because I'm a planner, right? The one thing I know how to do is make Excel charts, but not very well. This is a chart that shows you the number of people in the blue, the number of people in each generation that we have in the United States today, and then the red is how many are in the labor force. The thing I want you to focus on, if I can figure out how to do this, is that here's the baby boomers, over 80 million people. Now, I'm a baby boomer, right? I'm not a retiring baby boomer yet. But baby boomers are pretty used to running the show. We've controlled the market ever since we were teenagers, so that's 40 to 50 years now. We kind of expect that to continue to happen. And in fact, it is happening, and to some extent, and increasingly, it is happening as we retire, and we are more likely to retire to walkable communities. We are more likely to want to have community amenities and village-like settings near us as we retire. We are much less likely to retire to a Del Webb subdivision in Florida like our parents and our grandparents. That's one thing that is changing the housing market. The second, and maybe more important thing that's changing the housing market is this right here. This bar right here. That's the millennials. That's my daughter and her family and her generation. There's 90 million of them. They are trending away from suburban living even faster than we are. There are a variety of reasons for that, but it's pretty clear that they are not going to live a suburban life the way their parents and their grandparents did. They want to live in a different kind of setting. Not necessarily always a big city, but sometimes. They at least want to live in a place where they can walk. They at least want to live in a place where they are close to community amenities. And they are much less likely to have children, or at least to have lots of children, or at least to have children at home for a really long time. This chart shows you the change in household composition in this country from 1960 to 2025. You'll see in 1960, in the Leave It to Beaver age, when I was 5 years old, half of the households in this country had children at home. By 2025 in this country, that number is going to be 28%. 28% of the households will have children at home. So all of the things that drove that, like a desire to have a backyard, a desire to be in a good school district, that's going to be way less important generally to society. And in fact, and one of the things that has meant is that both these things mean that the housing demand is changing in a very dramatic way. Now this chart, yet another chart, is the result of a study that was done by Professor Chris Nelson at the University of Utah, in which he estimated future housing demand to 2025. He measured what was in place in 2003, what would be needed given changing demographics by 2025, and guess what he found? We don't need any more large lot houses in this entire country. We don't need any more. We already have more than enough. We already have more than enough. So one of the things you might want to ask yourself the next time you hear a developer tell you that they want to build a subdivision of half-acre lots or 1-acre lots or 2-acre lots is, one of the things you might want to ask him is, for who? Because the market's not there. The people aren't there. All of these folks are more likely to live in stacked flat apartments, or in condominiums, or in townhomes, or especially in small lots, single family, sometimes in lots with as little as 2,000 square feet. Now, wherever I go, the first person somebody says is, well, that may be true nationally, but that's not true here, wherever here is, right? So I took the liberty of figuring out what it looks like here, and here's what this is what Nashville-Davidson County looked like in 2010. 21.8% of the households had children at home. 1 out of every 5 households in this county in 2010 had children at home. There were many more households with a person living alone than families with children living at home. There were a lot more households with 2-person couples without children at home than there were with families with children living at home. And this trend is probably going to accelerate, but at the very least it's going to stay like this. So when you think about what the future you're planning for, and one of the things I learned both as a planner and a politician is you're always planning the future for somebody else, not for yourself, right? One of the things you have to bear in mind is that 4 out of every 5 households in the metro government area that you are planning for are not going to have children at home. And so that changes everything about the way you have to think about communities. This is not my main point tonight, but it's an important point to make because it is the market that underlies some of these other trends. Oops, I'm having a little bit, oh, there we go. So the kinds of things that we talk about in smart growth, which generally include smaller lot, single family, more mix of uses, more street connectivity, more pedestrian activity, more transit. All of these things are responsive to the market. This is Rockville Town Square in Rockville, Maryland. This is a half a mile from my nephew's house. And this is where he and his family walk to every weekend, to the Montgomery County Library right there, which is right next to, like, you know, the Gordon Biersch and everything else. This is the kind of, it's not the mall anymore that people drive to. It is the community center, the center of community activity that people want to walk to, that is driving the market and driving market trends. This is true, and one of the things that's doing is that is changing the revenue picture for local governments and where they can expect to get their revenue from. Let me show you two maps that were provided to me by Metro Planning. You all just got your property reassessed, right? Some of you are happy, some of you are sad, but you all got your property reassessed. Here's a map by council district of the changes in the change in commercial property value from 2009 to 2013, the darker red being a larger property value increase, and you see the pattern. Even more striking, however, is this one. This is the residential property value change, bluer being lower and redder being higher. Look where all the property value in this county is going. Is it going out here where politicians typically chase revenue? Nah. It's going down here, partly because this is you know, the affluent quarter out of Nashville, but it's going here. This is where the property value is increasing vastly. Not out here in the areas where you might expect additional homes to generate additional value, additional revenue, but in here. So when you look at a map like that, you got to begin to ask yourself, okay, what does that mean for the revenue picture of a local government? Because what local governments do, and having been an elected official for 8 years, I can tell you this, is local governments tend to chase revenue without thinking about cost. Local governments tend to chase revenue without thinking about cost, okay? Oh, there's a new subdivision. Oh, there's a new development project. Oh, we need the tax revenue, so we'd better approve it. And very rarely to local elected officials, particularly, who have developers knocking on their door, think about what the cost of accommodating and building the infrastructure for and serving on an ongoing basis, what the cost of that is. So that's one part of it. The market is changing. You can see the market is changing. You can see the market is changing by the change in property values in this county. Okay? And that has tremendous implications for the way you approach revenue and cost and the way your elected officials have to try to balance the budget. Let me talk just for a second on the second point. I'm not going to dwell on this, but it's pretty clear to me and to a lot of other people that the recipe for economic growth is changing. In the past, we assumed that sprawl meant prosperity, right? It was kind of the suburban era equivalent of the old industrial era saying, you know, where there's smoke, there's work, which I think was a term that was devised either in Pittsburgh or possibly in Chattanooga. Now that's not true anymore. Quality of place and a lot of other things have become important for ongoing prosperity. You're pretty lucky to be in a prosperous area. But increasingly, even for employment centers, we find a move away from the old suburban campus model to a new type of model of a more walkable, mixed-use, interactive place. That's where innovation occurs. That's where economic growth occurs. That's where jobs are created. And just to make one more point, and I have to get a hold of this because I keep gesturing instead of showing you a slide whenever I make this point. One of the things that economic development people in this country have been saying for decades is basically that Suburban development drives economic growth, and their evidence for that was the one-to-one relationship between driving and the economy. And so a friend of mine has a line chart, which I don't have, so you're going to have to watch me do this instead, okay, which shows back to 1970 the relationship between the relative growth between VMT and GDP. Vehicle miles traveled, that's how us nerdy planners measure driving, and GDP, the gross domestic product. And it goes like this. I think maybe I won't get the chart, the slide, because it's maybe more fun to just keep doing this, right? As it's the second time this week I've done this, in the last week I've done this. So they go, starting in 1970, they go up together like this, right? And then in about 2002, a really weird thing happens. I mean, they are absolutely in lockstep, driving and economic growth. And then in about 2002, before the recession, a really weird thing starts to happen, which is the economic growth keeps going up and the driving tapers off. And for 10 years now, economic growth and driving have had nothing to do with each other in this country for the first time ever. And that's because it is not suburban development, it is not the economic machine of suburbia that is driving the economy anymore. It is the economic machine of innovation, the economic machine of experience retail, the economic machine that requires quality of place, and particularly walkable place, to thrive, okay? That's the second point. I won't go into that in great detail because I want to get on to the main point of this talk, which is the third point. Remember I said that the market is changing. The market for housing is changing, and you saw that in those heat maps I showed you of Davidson County on your recent reassessment, okay? That's really important when we think about where the revenue comes from and where the cost is in balancing a local budget, right? When I was a mayor, I realized that the job of a local politician is pretty simple. You raise money in the most politically painless way possible, and you expend it in the most politically beneficial way possible, right? That's the job, that's the essential job of a local politician. And so when you think about how to, and so you run up against the idea of a tax increase to pay for services, and oftentimes we chase revenue and we don't unbundle that question of where the revenue comes from and where the cost goes and what the difference is. So let me talk a little bit generally about this, and then I'm going to talk more specifically about Nashville-Davidson County. When I was an elected official, it became very clear to me that our current development patterns, almost no matter where you are in the United States, are a fiscal strain on local government. Conventional suburban development is relatively low density. It is relatively low density. That requires an enormous upfront infrastructure investment, right? Primarily for roads, which is the single biggest capital cost for most local governments. And over time, the burden falls on taxpayers, and over time, the situation with a particular development project gets worse and worse, okay? I'm going to do another one of these air charts for you, all right? I'm from California, so this is a little bit more true there than it is here, but I think it's generally true that when you approve a new development project, let's say a new residential subdivision, you get a burst of revenue, right? You get a burst of revenue. You get impact fees, right, which many communities around here impose, and you get a kind of a burst of property tax, right? So you go from here up to here. And over time, as your assessed value does not increase so much, or as is the case for many of you, thankfully for you, go down, and you don't have any more impact fees, the revenue from that project goes the buying power from that project for the taxpayers goes like this. Meanwhile, the ongoing service cost is going up. You got to buy a new fire engine, you got to pay police officers, you got to repave miles and miles and miles of streets and roads that only serve a few people. And there comes a point where there's a crossover, right? There comes a point where the revenue from the particular project dips below the cost of serving that project. That happens almost inevitably. Some people who make this argument have called that a Ponzi scheme. I don't call it a Ponzi scheme. I would never do that. But some people do, and the reason they say that is that the only way to you get yourself into a hole on subdivision A, what's the only way to dig yourself out of the hole? The only way to dig yourself out of the hole is to approve subdivision B, right? So then you go like this again, and that masks what's truly happening, at least for a while. And this works fine till there's a real estate crash. When there's a real estate crash, there's no more new developments. There's no way to hide the fiscal problem that you have created. I experienced this personally as a mayor. I'll do one more air chart for you, which is the story of my political career, okay? Here was our revenue when I was elected to the city council. Here's what happened. Here was the revenue when I became mayor. Here's what happened to the revenue after I was mayor. This is when I decided not to run again. Okay? So when, after having closed both a library and a fire station, okay? So in a real estate bust, when there's no more new subdivisions to feed the machine, all of a sudden you are exposed and you have financial problems, and everybody assumes that there's some cosmic problem. Either the public employee unions are sticking it to the taxpayers, or somebody's inefficient, and all those things may be true, but it's also true that this Ponzi scheme of development has caught up with you. I personally think that this is going to get worse and worse, particularly as our population ages, because I don't think that we can afford to sustain people in the same environment they've been in for the last umpteen years. When I was an elected official, I served on the board of my local transit operator, okay? And we ran two systems. We ran a fixed route regular bus service, and we ran a dial-a-ride. Every time a passenger got on the fixed route bus service, it cost taxpayers $1. Every time a passenger got on the dial-a-ride, it cost taxpayers $20. Riding a dial-a-ride, in my experience, as an elected official, costs taxpayers 20 times as much money as getting somebody to ride a bus, okay? So if you're an older person and you have few options for getting around, and wouldn't you rather want to live somewhere where the tax dollars stretch farther and so you have better service, rather than spending the last 20 years of your life sitting in your single-family house waiting for someone to come and pick you up? I do not think there is enough money in the world to accommodate this situation for the millions and millions and millions of people who are gonna face it. And as I said before, you can't, as you begin to run low on developable land, you can't count on new subdivisions to bail you out fiscally. And Nashville-Davidson County is reaching that point where, although there's a lot of very hilly land that is still undeveloped, the easily developable flat land is almost gone. Not quite, but almost. And so, at the very least, you have to husband those land resources well and make sure that on that little additional raw land you still have, you don't lose money on it. Because at some point, you run out of land and then you're in a bind, right? Compact development in selected locations can change this equation somewhat, what we call smart growth. It can change the equation by increasing the revenue that is received at least on a per acre basis, and I'll go back and talk about why that is important, and certainly reduce the cost. Here's my favorite example, okay? I spent 8 years wrangling with firefighters. Not easy to do when you're in elected office, right? The way a typical fire department model works is You remember the national service standard for fire and medical emergency response times is respond within 5 minutes 90% of the time. Okay? That's the national standard. What does that mean? That means you have to put a fire station within a 5-minute drive of everything that you build. Think about that. In 8 years, that never once crossed my mind when I was thinking about approving a development project. I am going to have to figure out how to get a fire truck to that location within 5 minutes, okay? In other words, fire service and emergency medical service is extremely geographically sensitive, right? So here's an interesting study that was done by the city of Charlotte. Charlotte has 31 fire stations currently. They did a study to examine the number of residents served by each station and how that related to the development patterns, the housing patterns, and also the connectivity of all the streets. So this is a map of 2 of their fire stations, right? This is Station 2, which you can see is serves downtown and pretty close to adjacent to the downtown. And this is Station 31, which you can see serves a typical spaghetti wire suburban area, right? Station 2, Station 31, and because you have to put a fire station within 5 minutes of everything you build, right? They serve approximately the same geographical area, right, as fire stations tend to. But just looking at the map, you can see a pretty obvious difference, can't you? In all likelihood, if you ran the numbers, Station 31 probably doesn't have as many houses. And so it probably costs the taxpayers more to provide fire and emergency medical service to Station 31, right? Well, the city of Charlotte actually ran those numbers. This is the way it came out for a bunch of their stations. But essentially, and I have a little trouble seeing this from here, so I may get this wrong, but the bottom line was Station 2, I'll go back to here, Station 2 served 4 times as many households. So what did that mean? That means Station 31 was 4 times more expensive on a per household basis to serve its service area. In other words, the taxpayers on a per household basis were paying 4 times as much to run fire trucks around this area than around this area. And it was entirely because of the development pattern and the nature and the street connectivity. It had nothing to do with how many old people were there, how many heart attacks there were, how many fire trucks there were, whether the firefighters were any good, whether they were trained as paramedics. It had to do entirely with the development pattern and the street connectivity, nothing else. Smart Growth America is going to release a national study, of which the Nashville study is a part, in about 2 weeks. And one of the things that we're going to say is that we did additional calculations based on Charlotte's study, and what we found was if Charlotte's got a lot of vacant land left, right? If Charlotte, because I think it's a combined city-county as you are, I'm trying to remember, right, Rick? Charlotte-Mecklenburg County. It's a combined city and county, so they have a lot of land left. If Charlotte-Mecklenburg County built out its remaining, I think it's 100 square miles, like this rather than like this, they would save themselves 2 fire stations. 2 fire stations, each of which were estimated to cost $6 or $8 million a piece, so that's $12 or $15 million in capital cost, and each of which would cost $2.5 million a year to run, so that's $5 million a year in today's dollars that the general fund does not have to subsidize simply because you changed the development pattern and not for any other reason. Okay? We've seen these statistics all over and over again. This is from California, showing this is a study that showed 3 different types of development: fringe development, suburban infill, and urban infill. I won't tell you what the definitions are, but you get the general idea. And basically, this is the infrastructure cost, and that is the revenue derived per acre. infrastructure cost per acre, revenue derived per acre, okay? Show this to your finance director. I'll do this again in case your finance director didn't get the idea. This is how much it costs per acre in infrastructure. Here's the revenue you get. I'll do it again, okay? Here's the cost per acre of building the upfront infrastructure. Here's the revenue you get. Yeah, that's in California, which is a different tax system, I realize. But we found that this pattern holds pretty much everywhere in the country. I'll do it one more time for the finance directors in the audience. This is the upfront infrastructure cost. This is the revenue you get, both per acre, okay? One of my favorite examples, although I admit one that's hard to transfer elsewhere, is Arlington County, Virginia. That's right outside Washington, D.C. As you may know, if you've been to Washington, D.C., Arlington has 5 metro stations. They've built up mixed use around all of the metro stations very successfully. There's been a very strong market for that. The result of that is lots of value, lots of useful things, but the most important one for our conversation is that they get 1/3 of their property tax off of 7% of their land. Arlington County gets 1/3 of their property tax off of 7% of their land. Here's another example. This is from, I'm sorry, this is a bad slide. I'm just going to move to the next slide. Some of you may have come to hear Mitchell Silver talk in this speaker series. He's the planning director of Raleigh, a mostly built-out city. One of the things Mitchell's been working on is to try to show how that Arlington approach can be successful in another place. And so he made this, he didn't just come up with the revenue, he made a map of the revenue that would be generated if the general plan, proposed general plan, is built out the way it is designed. And what you like in a lot of built-out cities, the general plan of Raleigh calls for a lot more development in the downtown, and then a lot more development in along the arterial and commercial corridors radiating out of downtown, such as the one toward North Carolina State. I showed you a picture of North Carolina State before, although I didn't talk about it. What you see here is there's a lot of property that is off the tax rolls, which is typical for a large city. There's a lot of property which is single family, which generates not very much tax revenue per acre. And then there's the downtown. There's these skyscrapers of revenue in the downtown, and mid-rise revenue in the corridors. In other words, by locating pretty dense development in the downtown and along the corridors, you generate an enormous amount of revenue that would be very difficult to generate any other way in such a built-out city. So what Mitchell says is, I say to my elected officials, the choice is very simple. You can either do this, or you can raise taxes. You can either do this, or you can raise taxes. And I would say, or you can allow developers to intrude into existing single-family neighborhoods. That would be the third option. Those are 3 ways to generate more revenue to cover the cost of services. So think about it. If you're a typical taxpayer, which would you rather do? Would you rather have your taxes go up? Would you rather have the integrity of your single-family neighborhood compromised? Or would you rather allow smart growth development in selected locations where there's a market for it? That's the choice that faces most built-out cities today. And as I said, Nashville-Davidson County is moving toward a build-out situation. Let me talk a little bit, and then I'll conclude about what we found in Nashville. We compared 3 development projects. 2 in the suburbs and the Gulch. Well, you know the Gulch proposed project downtown. Bradford Hills, a conventional suburban project. Lenox Village, and I apologize that in future slides I misspelled Lenox, which I should have known better, but I did it. Which is kind of what you might call new urban suburban. There's a variety of housing types. It's tighter, more tightly developed, and the Gulch. Because from our national perspective, what we were looking for was more information about operating costs only, because there's overwhelming evidence that infrastructure cost is less in smart growth development. So we focused only on operating costs because we wanted to learn more about that. So we studied operating costs and revenue only for the general fund from these 3 development projects. And just to give you an idea, Bradford Hills, very, very typical suburban development project, right? Lenox Village, and there I misspelled it, I'm sorry. Lenox Village, right across the street from it, kind of a tighter, new urban design, right, with more different types of housing. And the Gulch downtown. Let me talk a little bit about a couple of the characteristics, and then I'll show you the results that we got. Bradford Hills and Lenox Village, one of the reasons that we did both of those is that they were about the same size, 185 acres. The Gulch is 76 acres. This is a pretty different story, however, right? Their housing stock is vastly different. Again, this is the acreage. Here's the number of housing units in each one. Obviously, the Gulch has a lot more housing units, right? But even Lenox Village and Bradford Hills are pretty different. They're the same size, and one has twice as many housing units as the other, right? Okay. So when we look at the operating cost under the revenues, mostly property tax, but some other things, and the operating cost borne by the general fund, the in and out of the general fund, what do we find? I'll give this to you in a number of different ways. Well, first we found that the Gulch produces millions and millions and would produce millions and millions and millions of more dollars of tax revenue per year than either of the other projects. Remember, these are 185 acres each. This is 76. It's not too surprising. It's not that different from this chart, right? It is related to the number of housing units, and you are fortunate in Nashville that you have a strong downtown housing market, right? Stronger than probably most cities. But that's what it looks like. So I know that probably what you're thinking is, okay, that's fine, but you know, urban development costs more to serve, right? So this can't look this great. And I grant you, urban development costs more to serve. You see the cost in the gray, right? Yes, the Gulch costs more to serve. There's no question about it. But, so when you look at the net revenue, what does that look like? Well, it looks even better, right? The net revenue generated here is very little, although there's a big difference between those two, and I'll get back to that. Whereas for the Gulch, it's many millions of dollars per year. That is revenue minus cost. Once you've paid for everything, once the Metro government has paid for everything, how much money do they have left over in the general fund to spend on other things in other places? Okay? The answer here is $9 million for the Gulch, somewhere around $200,000 for Lenox Square, and hardly anything for Bradford Hills. Now, the other thing I thought of was, well, sure, but they have that extra urban tax downtown, right? So that's probably accounting for a lot of this, right? And you're right, when you take the USD out, it only looks like that. So you can see the vast difference between there and there. You've still got $7 million left over. So in this case, what we found was, comparing the Gulch to these two suburban projects, the net surplus to the general fund, which is what you need in order to finance everything else, and to pay for those subdivisions that have gone red, have gone into deficit, it's enormous here, right? Now, let me go on and show you a couple of other things. If you compare just Lenox Village to Bradford Hills, the difference is still enormous. I took out the Gulch here because it was masking the fact that you're still about that a tighter, new urbanist project with a variety of housing types on the same footprint right next door to a conventional suburban project, it's like 10 times as much, right? It's 10 times as much. So this is kind of overwhelming, and I'll go back to that in a minute. But even if you are comparing different kinds of suburban development, there's an enormous difference, right? There's an enormous difference. A couple of other things about this. If you look at it per, you say, okay, sure, the Gulch has many more houses. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. But even on a per housing unit basis, it's a couple of $1,000 versus a couple of $100. And then take a look at it per acre, okay? Because remember what I said is, in a county where you have to begin to think about the day when you don't really have any developable land left anymore, how are you going to generate more revenue to make up for those subdivisions that have gone into deficit? You have to maximize your net revenue per acre, right? The net revenue per acre for Bradford Hills is something like $100. The net revenue per acre of Lenox Village is something like $800. The net revenue per acre of the Gulch is $115,000. At first, I didn't believe these numbers, but it turns out to be true. That building the Gulch generates $115,000 of net revenue to the general fund every year per acre, compared to hardly anything for Bradford Hills and less than $1,000 for Lenox Village. Remember, too, if I took out the Gulch again, there would be a big difference between here. Lenox Hills is 7 or 8 times, Lenox Village is 7 or 8 times more profitable, generates 7 or 8 times the surplus. Now, you know, I think it's reasonable for you to sit in the audience and say, okay, fine, but what if he's wrong? What if this is not right? What if either he's cooking the books or smoking us, or he just made a mistake, or the world isn't really like this, okay? And I think that's a fair question. That's a fair question. But think about it. What if I'm wrong by half? What if I'm 50% off? Okay? What if I'm off by 3/4? Right? The evidence is still overwhelming. And this is operating costs. This doesn't even count the infrastructure cost. So just to finish up, the bottom line, partly because the market is increasing for downtown and close-in neighborhood living, those are going to, and because those have more units per acre, those two things together, greater market demand, more units per acre, that means that those types of projects in those types of neighborhoods are going to generate a much bigger yield or surplus for the general fund as you try to balance your budget. As we see from Lenox Village, even a suburban village style development on the same footprint will generate a bigger surplus than a conventional suburban development. The biggest concern, if you think about it geographically, is how do you offset the growing cost and the growing deficit of the conventional suburban development, and especially the rural development, which requires an enormous amount of road maintenance relative to the number of people it serves. This is a way to do that. When you add infrastructure to the equation, which we didn't do in this analysis, partly because of resource constraints and partly because we had considerable evidence from other parts of the country and because we knew ULI was doing it here, when you add infrastructure to the equation, this argument would probably become much stronger. If we added in the cost of the upfront infrastructure on all these projects and the revenue that that Metro government received from these projects associated with infrastructure, Bradford Hills and Lenox Village would probably go into the red. And the Gulch, even if it required a big infrastructure investment in some ways, would probably be okay. It would probably still be generating a surplus. And this is the kind of thing you have to think about more than ever as you begin to run low on developable land, because you're not going to be able to play that game of new subdivisions covering up the cost of the old ones indefinitely. Sooner or later, you're going to run out of that. The market is moving away from that anyway, and the economics, the fiscal and economics of the more urban development is overwhelming. Now, go back to this slide just for a minute. I had somebody say to me, "Oh, so today somebody said to me, oh, so all we need is 2, 3 more gulches and we can build all the sprawl we want. Well, maybe, if that's your goal. And obviously, not every development project in a close-in, not every downtown project is going to be like the Gulch, and not every close-in neighborhood development is going to be like the Gulch. But again, even if I'm off on these numbers, and even if this line is much smaller, it's still a very, very compelling argument. And so the bottom line for me is, I have seen in my career of 30 years as a journalist, a researcher, an analyst, a land use planner, and a politician, I have seen elected officials chase revenue through development every day of my career. I've seen them chase revenue. And what I'm trying to suggest here is that chasing revenue through conventional suburban development for its own sake doesn't buy you anything. It doesn't make any sense. It at best is a break-even proposition. When you add in the infill, it probably loses money. And so, to the guy who said all we need is 2 or 3 more gulches, if you want to build conventional suburban development, for which, by the way, there is no market, right? If you want to build conventional suburban development, go ahead. But you're not doing it to make money for the government, because that's not going to happen. You might do it for a variety of other reasons, but don't do it because you think it's going to generate a surplus, because it's not, right? So, as I said in the paper this morning, okay, if there's no market for it, and it loses the taxpayers, and it costs the taxpayers money, then why would you do it? Now, there may be other reasons to do it. They may be good reasons, right? You may have a particular hole in your housing market that you may need to fill. You may need to have housing in a certain location. There may be political considerations related to the way developers and politicians interact with each other. Those are all fine. Those are all fine. But the market for this stuff isn't going to be very strong anymore, and it doesn't make any money. Whereas in the close-in neighborhoods and the downtown projects, the market's going to be very strong for the foreseeable future. And those projects are going to generate a much greater surplus for the general fund, which will cover the losses from the other development projects. So that's what we found. I'm very thrilled to be here. I love Nashville. I was here when Governor Glendening gave the kickoff speech a couple of months ago. You're very lucky to be in a very impressive and prosperous city. I wish you all the best, and I hope this helps you as you move forward and think about the future of Nashville. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bill, would you entertain some questions from the audience?
Sure. But before I start with the questions, though, I want to make one point. Marty, if you could stay up here. As some of you who have met me may know, I'm visually impaired. I have very little peripheral vision, and so it can be hard for me to see everybody with their hand up. So if you see somebody with their hand up that I don't see, would you point them out to me? There was a hand over there. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I started thinking about this about 6 or 8 years ago when I read Chris Lineberger's book, Adoption of Urbanism. You put it more clearly than I've heard anyone. I often use the example here in Nashville that whether you're building in the Gulch or you're building out in the suburbs, we have to pay $1,000 a unit for our tap fees, our sanitary impact fees for water and sewer. My question is, have you seen other cities adjust the way they assess impact fees, tap fees, and even perhaps the way they assess their property taxes?
Not the way they assess their property taxes, because property taxes by definition are by value. But certainly tap fees and impact fees, if you try to see them tied to the real cost, rather than simply imposing it. The tap fee you're describing is essentially a blended rate, right? Everybody pays the same no matter where they are. If you break that apart and look at the real cost of providing, say, the water, then that can lead you to, then that gives you an analytical foundation for a differential differential fee, and I've certainly seen that in many places, yes. There was a question, there was a hand over here.
Gentleman and back there first.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Fabian Bedne. Lennox Village is in my district. I'm a Metro councilman. I apologize I was late, so if I'm asking a question that you already answered ahead of me, I want to apologize to the audience. Lennox Village is not fully developed yet. Did you account to that, for that
This assumed build out, right, Rick? No, we just as the Gulch is not built yet, we assumed build out for Lennox Village. So we did not account for the fact, we assumed they were all built out.
Okay.
All right.
So that wasn't, I mean, you compared incomplete projects, is that what you're saying?
We compared the build out of 3 different projects, one, I guess, fully built, one part. Yes, yes. We compared projects on the assumption that they were all built, that all of them were built out, yes.
Okay. And the follow-up question is, did you account also for the consumption that the people in Lennox Village do on the immediate regional area? The shopping, I mean, in the Gulch you have...
No, what we did there, actually what we did there was, how did we account for the sales tax, the retail sales and the sales tax, I think is the question, right? We were not very sophisticated on that one. We simply assumed that every household in all of the projects spent the same amount of money, and so every household generated the same amount of sales tax. Not very sophisticated. The numbers you saw there were mostly about property tax, okay?
The gentleman over here.
Yeah, the Tennessee Land Trust offers tax easements, tax subsidies to owners of large, flat, easily developable pieces of land to not develop their land. And I'm just wondering, are these the kind of tax subsidies that you object to?
The question is, do I object to the Tennessee Land Trust, such things as the Tennessee Land Trust offering, you said, subsidies?
Tax easements. Tax subsidies.
I want to make sure I understand this. Are they buying conservation easements, or what are they doing?
Yeah, it's a conservation easement program.
They have a donated conservation easement that lowers the property.
Right, okay, I see. So do I object to the idea that easily developable land is sometimes goes into easement and therefore property taxes are lower? I'm kind of agnostic on that, but I would say not necessarily. I think that sometimes that property is good property to save. I mean, I'm speaking not about Tennessee, I'm speaking nationally. Sometimes you see property that's good property to save, sometimes you see property that ought to be developed, right? So I think that kind of easement properly used can help mold and organize urban and suburban development in a useful way when it is coordinated with a larger plan, such as the Nashville Next plan will be. Frankly, speaking about other parts of the country, since I have no experience here, sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't.
Yes, gentleman right there in the middle.
There was a recent article in the paper about from young couples who are moving into the downtown area. And one of the criticisms from the young couples with children, that 20%, is that there are no schools downtown. Therefore, there's a tremendous savings in the Gulch area because there's no schools.
This did not account for schools. This did not account for schools. This was the general fund this was the Nashville-Davidson County General Fund.
But the fact is, the city is not building schools downtown. And the main reason is that young people, that 20% who do have children, or 20% of families that have children at home, are not going to build in the downtown area.
They're not going to move to a place where there are no schools, is your point.
Exactly. And therefore, should we not account for those 20%, or is the increased revenue from the Gulch area going to pay for that 20%?
Is the increased revenue from the Gulch area going to pay for the schools downtown that aren't there?
No, for the people who do have children.
I think what you're driving at, if I don't want
Please.
to put words in your mouth, but I think what you're driving at is if by this information here, it's obvious that the downtown development clearly has a higher revenue basis. To encourage that even more and attract that 20% in, that perhaps Metro focus should be on providing quality schools downtown as well?
No, my point is that we do have to account for that 20%.
We have to account, sure.
That are having children. I have two sons. One lives in Dixon and one lives in downtown Nashville.
Mm-hmm.
One that lives in
It's like a control group, isn't it? Yeah. Tell us how their lives turn out. Will you come back in 40 years and tell us how their lives turn out?
one that lives downtown is in.
Right. I think you're right that people who live in a downtown or a close-in neighborhood are less likely to be people who have children or families. But I would make 2 points about this that I didn't make in the general talk. One is, both are anecdotal observations, okay? One is that just because you move to the suburbs because you want to be in a particular school district or near a particular school does not necessarily mean that that is where you are going to live your whole life, and therefore you are not part of this general trend. Remember, it used to be we didn't live very long and we had lots of kids. Now we don't have very many kids and we live a really long time. So one of the things that means is...
Correlation.
Right. We finally figured it out. So one of the things that means is you maybe have kids at home for 20 or 25 years, but you're living an independent life as an adult probably for 60 years, right? So a relatively small portion of your adult life is spent with children at home. So if you make that suburban choice, you don't necessarily have to stick with it forever. And one of the first points I made is that people my age, and I have a daughter who's about to get married, people my age are much more likely than our parents were, even if we've lived a suburban life, to leave that suburban life and resettle in a more walkable or close-in neighborhood after the kids are gone. Right? Now, a certain percentage of people like me go further out and buy a bigger house so all the grandchildren can come and visit, right? I've seen that. But in general, there are many, many more options for people because we don't, the world really isn't divided into people who have children at home their whole life and people who don't, right? Most people do not have children at home for most of their adult life, most of their home-consuming life. The second point I would make, and again, this is anecdotal, is there is the question of what happens, so hipsters move downtown or in a close-in neighborhood, they hook up, they fall in love, and they get married and have kids, or possibly in the reverse order, and they have been living in this close-in neighborhood for a long time. What do? And a lot of people who are skeptical of my argument will say, oh, well, obviously then they're going to move to the suburbs and buy an SUV or possibly 2 or 3, right? My anecdotal, clearly some of them are going to do that, but anecdotal evidence based on my talking to people in settings like this over the entire country is that those folks are more likely to stay if they've already put down roots in that neighborhood by the time they have kids. They've lived there for 5 or 10 years. They're part of a cohort who lives in that neighborhood. I was telling Rick earlier, I was in Atlanta recently, and I was talking to probably about a 35-year-old guy who lives in Inman Park, close-in neighborhood in Atlanta. And he said, yeah, my wife and I have lived there for 10 years. We just have had kids. The elementary school stinks, but there's 40 couples like us who all had kids at the same time. So we're going to stay and we're going to turn the school. And you see that more and more. And that way, at least they hold it through elementary school. So I think it's a little bit more, I take your point, but I think it's a little bit more fluid. This school thing is a little more fluid than people think.
I had a gentleman over here.
Yes, sir.
Your third option about letting developers infringe on existing developments is very intriguing. Have you seen any good examples, including the possibility of eminent domain or subsidies from the government to allow you to buy out several individual property owners?
Yes, I actually have seen that. Eminent domain, probably not. There have been a few examples. Now, obviously, you wind up with this. I was posing that as an unlikely option, okay, as an option that would seem unattractive to most people, right? You can raise taxes. You can have somebody build an apartment building next door to your house, or you can do this, right? I was trying to draw a contrast in case you didn't notice. There have been a few instances in this country, because obviously sometimes in close-in neighborhoods, a single-family neighborhood will wind up being surrounded by bigger development. There have been a few instances in which those homeowners have banded together and basically sold the neighborhood to a developer at an enormous profit. But that basically requires everybody or almost everybody to buy into it, which is extremely unlikely. That's happened 2 or 3 times in the country that I can think of. And the thought of using eminent domain to do that, I think, is probably not on the table anywhere in the country.
Questions? Yes, in the back.
Let's talk about the Gulch and I guess hipster love. Gulch is a bit of an expensive area, and so if you're a renter or a hipster, how do you have any advice on affordable housing in urban areas?
Do I have any advice on affordable housing in urban areas? I think that's an issue that ULI should take on. No, I'm just.
We do have an affordable housing committee.
I think that I think there are 2 answers to that. The first one is that argues for a wide variety of housing type, right? What we tend to do in this country is segregate our housing type so that every neighborhood and every project has a different housing type. The more we mix it up, the more affordable pockets we're going to create, right? And then, so I think that's the main, other than having lots of roommates, which seems to be the default solution almost everywhere in the country, which might lead to the children later on, right? That I think, from a policy perspective, I think that is the one that makes the most sense. And I think that's easier to implement in downtowns or in close-in neighborhoods that are looking at infill than it is out in the suburbs, which have been segregated by housing type by day one. There are a variety of other subsidies and set-asides you could bring into the equation. That gets tricky when you start talking about middle-income people or people who are at the beginning of their careers. I won't go into that. But I do think mixing up the housing type as much as possible, particularly in these urban locations, is an imperative in dealing with that. Because then, you know, if you get older and you do have hipster love and you move up the hipster chain, right, then maybe you can afford to buy a place and in the same neighborhood where you've been living for the last 10 years.
So, yes, question over there.
Well, on that multi-roommate concept, do you see much in multi-generational housing with the aging boomers, immigrants, and different things?
The question is, do I see much in terms of multi-generational housing? I think that's what the suburbs are going to be for, because that's where the big housing spaces are going to be. You know, I'm from LA, and what I found, particularly in the heavily Asian communities, which are more likely to to have multi-generational households, when they got to a certain affluence level, they would troll certain parts of town which for pretty big houses, right? So, you know, for better or worse, I think that is more likely where the multi-generational housing stock is going to be, because who else are you going to sell those houses to, right? The double income, no kids, probably not going to buy those big suburban houses. That's probably one of the underlying concerns here is if there's no market for large lot single family, who buys it, right? And in LA, where everybody's sitting on $1 million of equity, that's an enormous underlying, you know, anxiety that practically everybody has. Who's going to buy my house and bail me out and, you know, pay for my assisted living, right? You know, and so I think that a multi-generational household is probably a good candidate, although it's not ideal from a mobility perspective, to acquire and live in the larger suburban homes. But I don't see that stuff being built in large numbers in more urban areas. The gentleman right behind you.
Yeah, you mentioned one thing like being a finance director and looking at your net revenue
But the problem that I see is that some developments get payment in lieu of taxes or tax increment financing, so it's really hard to figure out what your income flow is going to be. So if you go out to one development, gets a big tax break, and another doesn't, how can you compare apples and oranges?
Well, I think you got to take. I think you got to take that into account. I mean, I don't think it's that complicated to take that into account, and certainly you would have to do that on the Gulch, which would be built with some TIF financing. There's no question about that. Yeah.
As property values increase, density increases in the city, and you have gentrification, people with modest income, low income, or have to live somewhere. So we see, I think this is true, of migration of low-income people to the declining suburbs. And it's harder to provide those kinds of services that, such as, you know, it's very difficult to provide a bus service where there's not much density. So you have low-income people moving to the suburbs where the services they may need are harder to provide. What is the policy implication of that, and am I correct?
No, the point was that if cities and close-in neighborhoods gentrify, then people of modest means are likely to be driven to older suburbs where it is difficult to provide services, where the walking advantages aren't there, where the transit advantages aren't there. I think you're absolutely right. I think the policy implications of that go like this. First of all, if you're truly concerned about that, I don't see any, I think you have to find a way to carve out a certain amount of housing stock in the city and the close-in neighborhoods that are protected from the market. Okay? Now that can be very controversial. That can be inclusionary housing. That can be a nonprofit housing entity building something. It can be any one of those things, right? That can be controversial, but if the market is hot and the prices go up and you want those people to stay, or at least some of them, I think you have to do that. One of my favorite, rather peculiar examples of this actually is in the Columbia Heights neighborhood of Washington, D.C., which 5 years ago was all, was still drug-strewn, and today is like the hippest neighborhood in town, and they just got a 3-story Target on top of the metro station, right? But there are still quite a number of old public housing projects in that neighborhood. So there is a mixture of residents, which is owned by the D.C. Housing Authority, right? So there is a mixture of residents there and will be as long as the D.C. Housing Authority still holds that property. So that's one thing. And then I think you got, the thing that you got to do in the older suburbs are a really tough problem. You're right about that. The opportunity there lies probably in trying to figure out how to redevelop the obsolete retail sites, either shopping centers or commercial strips. If you can do that right and begin to create a walking environment and change the streets up, right? This requires money, and change the streets up so that they are more walkable and focused on transit and stuff, and you can redevelop the commercial strips and the shopping centers, you can begin to bring some of those characteristics that we talk about in the close-in neighborhoods into the suburbs. And so I think the answer is partly finding a way to carve out a certain amount of the housing stock so that some of the people can stay, and then altering those parts of the suburban environment that you can alter, which are the streets and the obsolete retail parcels, to make those more walkable and provide more of these characteristics and make it easier to provide transit and those other services. But I agree with you that that is one of the most difficult emerging problems in planning in the United States.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up. Let's just give a real great Nashville welcome, Bill. Thank you so much for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much, Mario.
Really appreciate it.
Okay.
It's great. Just a couple quick closing remarks. Thank you again to our sponsors for the Speaker Series, the Greater Nashville Association of Realtors, Regent Homes, and the Village Fund. Remember that the Speaker Series concludes in 2 weeks with Amy Liu joining us for a speech titled Regional Partnerships to Achieve Local Viability. Ms. Liu will speak on Monday, May the 6th at 5:30 right here in the Children's Theater. Again, I encourage you to visit the NashvilleNext NashvilleNext.net website and read all the background reports. Also, this presentation will be available on the website. And remember that on tomorrow night's News Channel 5 Open Line, Nashvillians will discuss Bill Fulton's speech and its implications for Nashville. It's tomorrow night from 7 to 8, News Channel 5's Open Line. Finally, if you're interested in learning more about Nashville Next and sharing it with your neighbors, your colleagues, or your friends, please go to the NashvilleNext.net website where you can join the online conversation or sign up to have a planner conduct a visioning session in your neighborhood or with your group. Again, it's NashvilleNext.net. Thanks again for coming, and we will see you all Monday, May the 6th.